We're watching something extraordinary unfold in Venezuela right now, and it reveals everything about how power actually works in our world today. Nicolas Maduro just arrested an American citizen, a Navy SEAL, and the timing couldn't be more deliberate. This isn't some random incident. This is Maduro sending a direct message to Donald Trump before he even takes office, testing the boundaries, seeing how far he can push. But here's what most Americans don't understand. Venezuela isn't just about oil anymore, or socialism, or even Maduro's survival. It's become a chess piece in a much larger game between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. Russia has invested billions in keeping Maduro afloat. They've sent military advisors, weapons systems, and economic lifelines when everyone else walked away. China holds massive debts that Venezuela can never repay. So the real question isn't whether Trump will act, it's whether Russia will draw a red line in Caracas the same way they did in Damascus. Will Putin extend his protective umbrella over Maduro, turning Venezuela into another Syria? Because if he does, we're looking at a geopolitical confrontation 90 miles from Florida, and almost nobody in Washington is prepared for what that means. The Americas aren't immune from great power competition anymore. They're becoming its next battlefield. Let me start by saying something that might surprise you. Venezuela's crisis isn't really about Venezuela at all. It never has been. What we're witnessing is the culmination of decades of American foreign policy mistakes, compounded by a new geopolitical reality that Washington simply refuses to acknowledge. And now, with Trump returning to power and an American serviceman sitting in a Venezuelan jail, we're about to see whether the United States has learned anything from 20 years of failed interventions, or whether we're destined to repeat the same catastrophic patterns that gave us Iraq, Libya, and the ongoing tragedy in Syria. I've spent my entire career studying how nations rise and fall, how empires overextend themselves, and how economic policies either build prosperity or destroy it. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what's happening in Venezuela right now is a perfect case study in everything we've done wrong in Latin America for the past century. But it's also something new, something we haven't fully confronted yet. It's a test case for whether the United States can still project power in its own hemisphere when major adversaries decide to push back. Because make no mistake, Russia and China aren't in Venezuela by accident. They're there because they've calculated that America's grip on Latin America is weakening, and they're right. Let's go back and understand how we got here, because context matters enormously. Venezuela was once the wealthiest country in South America. It had the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia. It had an educated middle class, functioning democratic institutions, and a standard of living that made it the envy of the region. So what happened? The simple answer that you'll hear from most American commentators is that socialism destroyed Venezuela. Hugo Chavez came to power, implemented radical leftist policies, nationalized industries, and ran the economy into the ground. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, continued these disastrous policies, and now Venezuela is a failed state with hyperinflation, mass immigration, and humanitarian catastrophe. End of story, right? Socialism fails again. Capitalism wins. Case closed. But that narrative is dangerously incomplete, and it blinds us to the actual dynamics at play. Yes, Chavez made serious economic mistakes. Yes, the over-reliance on oil revenues without economic diversification was foolish. Yes, corruption became endemic. And yes, democratic institutions were weakened. All of that is true. But what that narrative conveniently omits is the role that the United States has played in actively trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy and overthrow its government for the past 2 decades. We've imposed some of the most comprehensive economic sanctions ever levied against a country that hasn't invaded anyone, doesn't possess nuclear weapons, and poses no military threat whatsoever to the United States. These sanctions haven't just targeted the government, they've deliberately targeted the Venezuelan people, making it impossible for the country to import food, medicine, spare parts for infrastructure, and basic necessities. The stated goal has always been regime change. We've said it explicitly over and over again. And when economic warfare didn't work fast enough, we've funded opposition groups, recognized opposition leaders as the legitimate president, even though they'd never won an election, and we've even backed coup attempts. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, but Professor Sachs, Maduro is a dictator. He's rigged elections, he's imprisoned opposition leaders, he's using violence against his own people. Doesn't America have a responsibility to support democracy? And look, I understand that impulse, I really do. Democratic governance matters, human rights matter. But let me ask you this. When has regime change ever worked out the way we promised it would? Not in Iraq, not in Libya, not in Afghanistan, not in Syria. Every single time we've told the American people that if we just remove this one bad leader, democracy will flourish, markets will open, and everyone will be better off. And every single time, what we've actually created is chaos, state collapse, humanitarian disaster, and power vacuums that get filled by extremists or competing foreign powers. We never learn. We never pause to ask whether our intervention might make things worse. We never consider whether the people we're claiming to help actually want our help, or whether they might prefer to determine their own future, even if it's messy and imperfect. And here's the thing about Venezuela specifically. Our intervention has made the situation dramatically worse, not better. The sanctions have devastated the economy far more than Maduro's policies ever could have alone. When you cut a country off from the international financial system, when you prevent them from selling their primary export, when you freeze their foreign assets and make it illegal for companies to do business with them, you're not punishing the government. The elites always find ways to survive. You're punishing ordinary people who can't get insulin for their diabetes, who can't find spare parts to fix the electrical grid, who watch their children go hungry because food imports have collapsed. And then we stand back and point to the resulting suffering and say, see? This is what socialism does. It's deeply dishonest and it's morally bankrupt. But let's move beyond the ethics for a moment and talk about strategic realities, because that's what this is really about. The United States has operated in Latin America for over a century under the assumption that this is our sphere of influence, our backyard, and that no other major power has any business being here. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, essentially said that European powers needed to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and we've enforced that principle ever since, sometimes with diplomacy and sometimes with military force. We've overthrown governments in Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, Panama, Grenada, and many others when we felt our interests were threatened. We've installed dictators, funded death squads, and turned a blind eye to massive human rights abuses, as long as the governments in question were friendly to American business interests. This isn't conspiracy theory or anti-American propaganda. This is documented historical fact. It's what we did, and in many cases we did it openly. But here's what's changed. The world is multipolar now, whether we like it or not. China has become the largest trading partner for most countries in South America. They've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure, mining, agriculture, and technology across the region. Russia, while less economically powerful than China, has reestablished military and political ties throughout Latin America, selling weapons, conducting joint exercises, and offering political support to governments that feel threatened by Washington. And both Moscow and Beijing have looked at Venezuela and seen an opportunity. They've seen a country with massive natural resources, a government that's desperate for international support, and a perfect chance to demonstrate that the United States can no longer dictate outcomes in its own hemisphere. Russia's involvement in Venezuela is particularly significant, and it mirrors what they've done in Syria, which should worry us considerably. When the Syrian civil war broke out and it looked like Bashar al-Assad might fall, Russia made a calculated decision to intervene militarily. They sent their air force, their military advisors, their special forces, and they turned the tide of the war. Why? Because Syria hosts Russia's only Mediterranean naval base, because they wanted to demonstrate their reliability as an ally in contrast to how we abandoned Mubarak in Egypt, and because they wanted to show that they could project power beyond their immediate borders. It worked. Assad is still in power. Russia has expanded its Middle Eastern influence, and the United States was essentially sidelined in a region we dominated for decades. Now look at Venezuela through that same lens. Russia has invested somewhere between $10 and $20 billion in Venezuela over the past 15 years, mostly in the oil sector, but also in mining, agriculture, and other industries. They've sold Venezuela advanced weapon systems, including S-300 air defense missiles and Su-30 fighter jets. They've sent military advisors, and there have been persistent reports of Russian private military contractors, the same Wagner group that operated in Syria, operating in Venezuela. Russian warships have made port calls in Caracas. They've conducted joint military exercises. All of this sends a very clear message. Russia considers Venezuela a strategic partner, and they're not going to let the United States overthrow the government without a fight. China's involvement is different but equally significant. China doesn't station troops abroad or sell massive weapon systems to Venezuela, but they've done something arguably more powerful. They've made themselves indispensable to Venezuela's economy. China holds over $50 billion in Venezuelan debt. They've made massive loans that Venezuela has no realistic way of repaying except through oil shipments. China has become Venezuela's primary source of investment capital, consumer goods, and technology. They've built housing, infrastructure, and telecommunications networks. When Western companies pulled out of Venezuela because of sanctions or political risk, Chinese companies filled the vacuum. And this gives China enormous leverage, not just over Venezuela, but over the entire region. They can point to Venezuela and say to other Latin American countries, look, when Washington turns on you, we'll still be there. We don't lecture you about human rights or democracy. We don't impose sanctions, we just do business. Now let's talk about Donald Trump, because his return to the presidency changes the calculus significantly. Trump's first term gave us some preview of his approach to Venezuela, and it was characterized by maximum pressure and maximum rhetoric, but minimal actual results. His administration recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela, even though Guaido had never won a presidential election and controlled no territory. It was a bizarre situation where we pretended that someone was president simply because we said so. Trump imposed crushing sanctions, and he even openly discussed military intervention, famously asking his advisors why we couldn't just invade Venezuela. His national security team, people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, were clearly eager for regime change. They talked about it constantly. Bolton even admitted in his memoir that they were actively planning coups, and yet, despite all of this, Maduro remained in power. The military stayed loyal. Russia and China continued supporting him, and the humanitarian situation got worse, not better. So what will Trump do differently this time? That's the question everyone is asking right now, especially in light of this arrested American SEAL. Trump's foreign policy has always been transactional and unpredictable, which makes him both potentially more flexible and potentially more dangerous than traditional foreign policy establishment figures. On one hand, Trump doesn't have the ideological commitment to democracy promotion that neoconservatives have. He's perfectly willing to deal with dictators if he thinks he can get a good deal. He's praised Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping at various times. He's not interested in nation building or humanitarian intervention. This could theoretically make him more open to some kind of negotiation with Maduro, some kind of transactional arrangement where sanctions get eased in exchange for certain concessions. On the other hand, Trump is extremely sensitive to perceived disrespect, and having an American serviceman arrested and paraded on Venezuelan television is exactly the kind of provocation that could trigger an impulsive, aggressive response. Trump's entire political brand is built on projecting strength and never backing down from a fight. He can't afford to look weak, especially not to a government that he and his supporters have consistently portrayed as a socialist failure. And Trump's advisors in his second term, people like Marco Rubio, who has been one of the most hawkish voices on Venezuela for years, are going to be pushing him toward confrontation, not compromise. Rubio represents Florida, which has a large Venezuelan American population that strongly supports regime change. The political pressure on Trump to take action will be substantial. But here's where it gets really complicated. And this is the part that I think most Americans haven't fully grasped yet. If Trump decides to escalate, whether that means more sanctions, support for another coup attempt, or God forbid, military action, Russia and China will face a choice. Do they back down and let the United States overthrow a government they've invested billions in supporting? Or do they double down, increase their own support for Maduro, and dare the United States to start a confrontation that could spiral into something much larger? Based on everything we've seen in Syria and Ukraine and the South China Sea, I think we have to assume they'll double down. Russia has already demonstrated in Syria that they're willing to use military force to protect client states. China has demonstrated throughout the developing world that they'll provide economic lifelines to governments that the West tries to isolate. Neither Moscow nor Beijing wants to establish a precedent that the United States can still overthrow governments in any region it chooses simply through economic warfare and covert action. Think about what this means practically. If Trump tries to remove Maduro by force or through a military-backed coup, and Russia responds by sending more military personnel, more air defense systems, more weapons, what happens then? Do we bomb Russian positions in Venezuela the way we would never dare bomb them in Syria? Do we accept a scenario where Russian military forces are operating 90 miles from Florida indefinitely? Do we blockade Venezuela's ports, risking direct confrontation with Russian or Chinese vessels? None of these are hypothetical questions anymore. These are real scenarios that military planners in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing are actively wargaming right now. And let's be honest about something else that nobody wants to say out loud. American military options in Venezuela are far more limited than our rhetoric suggests. Yes, the United States has vastly superior military power than Venezuela. We could destroy Venezuela's military in a matter of days if we chose to. But then what? We'd be occupying a country of nearly 30 million people, most of whom would view us as invaders rather than liberators. We'd be fighting an insurgency in difficult terrain, mountains, jungles, urban areas, against opponents who would be receiving weapons and support from Russia, China, Cuba, and potentially others. We'd be doing this at the same time we're trying to manage tensions with China over Taiwan, continuing our involvement in supporting Ukraine against Russia, and dealing with ongoing commitments in the Middle East. We're already overstretched militarily. Our defense industrial base is struggling to keep up with current commitments, and the American people have shown repeatedly that they have no appetite for another long-term military occupation. Iraq and Afghanistan are still fresh wounds. Does anyone seriously think that occupying Venezuela would go better than those disasters? This is why I've been arguing for years that we need a completely different approach to Latin America and to Venezuela specifically. We need to abandon this fantasy that we can or should control political outcomes throughout the hemisphere. We need to recognize that other powers are going to have influence in Latin America, just as we have influence in Asia, Africa, and Europe. We need to accept that countries get to choose their own governments, even if we don't like their choices. And we need to understand that our economic sanctions, which we deploy more than any other country in the world, are tools of warfare that cause immense human suffering without actually achieving their stated objectives. When sanctions fail, we don't conclude that sanctions don't work. We just impose more sanctions. It's insanity. What would an alternative approach look like? First, we'd need to acknowledge that our regime change efforts have failed and that continuing them will only make things worse. Second, we'd need to be willing to negotiate with the Maduro government directly, without preconditions that demand they surrender power before talks even begin. Third, we'd need to gradually lift sanctions in exchange for concrete steps toward political reconciliation inside Venezuela. Things like releasing political prisoners, allowing international election observers, opening space for opposition parties to organize freely. Fourth, we'd need to work with other Latin American countries, with the United Nations, with the Organization of American States to create a framework for dialogue that doesn't involve foreign intervention but does involve international mediation. And fifth, we'd need to accept that even if we do all of this, Venezuela's political evolution might not happen on our timeline, and it might not produce a government that we particularly like. I know this sounds like appeasement to some people. I know it sounds like we're rewarding a dictator, but the alternative is what we've been doing for 2 decades, and it hasn't worked. It's produced more suffering, more instability, more migration, and now it's drawing in major adversaries who see an opportunity to diminish American influence. At some point, we have to be honest about what our actual interests are and what we're realistically capable of achieving. Our interest is not in controlling Venezuela's government. Our interest is in regional stability, in addressing the humanitarian crisis that's produced millions of refugees, in ensuring that hostile powers don't establish military bases that threaten us, and in eventually reintegrating Venezuela into the hemispheric economy. None of those interests are served by the current approach. The tragedy is that we've painted ourselves into a corner rhetorically and politically. We've spent so many years demonizing Maduro, declaring him illegitimate, recognizing other people as Venezuela's president, that backing down now looks like weakness. American politicians from both parties have built careers on being tough on Venezuela. The Venezuelan American community in Florida, which is politically powerful, largely supports maximum pressure, and our credibility, already damaged from so many failed interventions, would take another hit if we negotiate with someone we've called a dictator who must go. These are real political constraints that any president faces, Trump included. But leadership means making difficult choices, and sometimes it means admitting that our previous approach wasn't working. Nixon went to China even though he'd built his career as an anti-communist crusader. Reagan negotiated with the Soviet Union even though he'd called them an evil empire. Obama opened relations with Cuba after 50 years of failed isolation. Trump himself met with Kim Jong-un despite decades of refusing to negotiate with North Korea. So there's precedent for changing course when circumstances demand it. The question is whether Trump has the political courage and strategic vision to apply that same logic to Venezuela, or whether he'll listen to the hawks who will tell him that more pressure, more threats, and potentially military action are the answers. Here's what I fear most: that we'll stumble into a confrontation that nobody actually wants, but that becomes unavoidable because we've backed ourselves into corners. Maduro feels like he has to demonstrate strength by arresting Americans or provoking the United States because showing weakness could encourage his domestic opponents and make Russia and China question their support. Trump feels like he has to respond forcefully to any provocation because backing down would be politically devastating and would embolden adversaries elsewhere. Russia and China feel like they have to support Maduro more strongly because abandoning him would make them look unreliable to other countries they're trying to court as partners. And so each side takes actions that feel necessary from their perspective, but that collectively push us closer to a crisis that could spiral out of control. This is exactly how World War I started. Nobody wanted that war. Every major power thought they were acting defensively, protecting their interests, maintaining their credibility. But the system of alliances, the military mobilization schedules, the political pressures, and the breakdown of communication meant that a regional crisis in the Balkans became a global catastrophe. I'm not saying Venezuela will cause World War III, that's hyperbolic. But I am saying that when great powers start drawing red lines in third countries, when military forces from rival nations are operating in close proximity, when domestic political pressures prevent rational negotiation, bad things happen. Miscalculations happen, accidents happen, and suddenly you find yourself in a crisis that nobody wanted, but that everyone feels they have to escalate because backing down is politically impossible. This is why diplomacy matters. This is why having diplomatic channels open even with adversaries matters. This is why international institutions that can mediate disputes matter. And this is why we need political leaders who are willing to take political risks for peace rather than always choosing the path that looks tough but leads to disaster. The United States is still an enormously powerful country with tremendous advantages. We don't need to dominate every region, control every outcome, or respond to every provocation with maximum force to maintain our security and prosperity. In fact, the opposite is true. Overextension, endless interventions, and the belief that military power can solve complex political problems, these things weaken us. They drain our resources, divide our society, and create the very threats we're trying to prevent. So as we watch this situation unfold with Trump, Maduro, Russia, and the fate of Venezuela, I hope we can have an honest conversation about what American foreign policy should actually be trying to achieve and what methods actually work. Not the conversation that the foreign policy establishment wants to have, where the only debate is between different forms of pressure and intervention, but a real conversation about whether this entire approach to the world makes sense, whether it serves American interests, and whether there might be a better way forward that doesn't involve treating diplomacy as weakness and war as inevitable.